The podcast you are about to listen to is not a medical podcast, nor is it designed to diagnose a condition. While there are medical experts on this show, any questions regarding medical care or concern should be directed to a primary care physician.
Welcome to Game on Glio, the podcast providing hope, inspiration, education, and real conversations around the difficult journeys of grief and loss, and being diagnosed with brain cancer, such as glioblastoma. I'm your host, Shannon Traphagen. If you enjoy our show, please consider writing a review. Also, share us with a friend. You can follow us on Facebook at Game on Glio or on Instagram at Game on Glio Podcast. Or you can visit our website, thegameongliopodcast.com, for our blog, insights, and guest snapshots. Season 2 of the Game on Glio podcast is sponsored by GT Medical Technologies and Gamma-Tile Therapy. Learn more at gtmedtech.com. This episode is brought to you by MimiVax LLC, developing immunotherapeutic vaccines and therapies for treatment of cancers such as glioblastoma. Learn more at mimivax.com, and by OncoSynergy, developing patient-focused immunotherapies. Learn more at oncosynergy.com. The poet laureate Simon Armitage recently wrote a poem for the Institute of Cancer Research. Only his second poem as a poet laureate, Simon drew inspiration from the work of many cancer research centers and their drug discoveries through clinical trials. His poem reflects on the ambition, the optimism, and the brilliance that all form part of the search for new precision treatments for cancer. The importance of clinical trials is all about this. Clinical trials are not only vital, but they're so important for the discovery of new treatments for diseases like cancers, as well as to detect and diagnose, but also reduce the chance of either developing the disease or the disease getting worse. And clinical trials are more important than ever in the area of brain cancer. And there are so many innovative clinical trials currently taking place. Simon's poem entitled "Finishing It" speaks to this very effort. I can't configure a tablet chiseled by God's finger, or forge a scrawled prescription. But here's an inscription, formed on the small white dot of its own, full stop. The sugared pill of a poem, one sentence that speaks ill of illness itself, a bullet with cancer's name carved brazenly on it. This poem is powerful in what it speaks of. So many ways that we are trying so desperately to find new treatment methods, find ways of shortening the lifespan of a disease, particularly cancer. Clinical trials are so vital to the work that everybody is doing in the area of glioblastoma and brain cancer. And we have some amazing recruitment going on for current clinical trials. One of those is the SurVaxM vaccine, and the clinical trial that was developed by our guest today and his colleague through Roswell Park Cancer Center by manipulating the survivin protein. It's really intriguing to see some of the creative ways that scientists and researchers and doctors are thinking outside the box as they find ways to tackle brain cancers such as glioblastoma. Our guest today is here to speak to that effort. His name is Michael Ciesielski, and he will be with us next after a brief word from our sponsor.
Imagine waking up from brain tumor removal surgery knowing that your radiation treatment is already underway. That's how Gamma-Tile therapy works. At the end of brain tumor removal surgery, your neurosurgeon implants tiny gamma-tiles where the tumor is most likely to return. So instead of waiting to start daily standard radiation treatments that go on for weeks, you get a head start against tumor cells and get back to your life sooner. Gamma-Tile therapy is for operable brain tumors of all types, including glioblastomas, brain metastases, and meningiomas. It is a one-time targeted radiation treatment with fewer side effects and far less chance of hair loss than external radiation. Gamma tau therapy is FDA-cleared radiation therapy for patients with newly diagnosed malignant brain tumors and recurrent brain tumors. Gamma tau therapy is tough on tumors and easier on patients and caregivers. Learn more at gammatile.com.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Ciesielski, and he is the CEO of MimiVax, a company that was formed to develop the SurVaxM vaccine for clinical use. He's the co-inventor of the survivin vaccine technology alongside Dr. Fenstermaker, on which MimiVax was founded. He joined their academic faculty of Roswell Park Cancer Center back in 2004 after obtaining his PhD in immunology. And alongside Dr. Fenstermaker, they established the Neuro-Oncology Laboratory. Dr. Ciesielski, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great opportunity, and really looking forward to sharing some of our experiences and share some of our development of the drug with your listeners.
I'm excited to have you on. I know that I have been talking about SurVaxM for quite some time on this show, and we've been putting out news alongside of that about the clinical trials. So I'm really excited to dive into this today and really give our listeners some really great information on what is going on in the world of brain cancer when it comes to new drug treatments, new options, clinical trials. A lot of people are always on pins and needles when it comes to other things that can be tried because of how aggressive, especially glioblastoma, can be. So very excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much. It's glioblastoma. I mean, when patients hear that, is obviously such a devastating diagnosis. And what we really want to do, and particularly with our company and trial, is to provide these patients some hope and hopefully direct them to a therapy that might help them, be it ours or many other therapies that are out there. I think the overall goal of things is to introduce patients to clinical trials and any available treatments that might be applicable to their particular types of cancer.
I agree. And I think the more information people have, the better armed they are to tackle and deal with the diagnosis. Let's start with how you kind of started out in this field. What led you to working in immunology and neurology, specifically on the research side of things?
So it started a long time ago, probably over 20 years at this point. So I started off at Roswell Park Cancer Center, and at that time, Dr. Fenstermaker was looking to start up a lab at the same time, and we connected and built the Neuro-Oncology Laboratory at Roswell. For me, it was something that I had been interested in terms of brain cancer research. Immunology was something that was just kind of coming a little more aware at that time. It was really still in the dark ages when we started this, but my background was in molecular immunology. That's what my PhD was. So I was anxious to find new ways to treat some of the patients that Dr. Fenstermaker was seeing in the clinic. And as we started in basic research, we were looking at genes that drove brain tumor formation and things like that. Very basic academic type research.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, you start to recognize that you really want to move some of these agents that you're working on out of the lab and do some good to maybe improve somebody's life. We see things in the lab that work in test tubes and dishes all the time.
Right.
There seems to be a bit of a gap before that can jump into the clinic. And that was really what drove us, that I think we really want to find some type of drug or some agent, something that could really have an impact on patients' lives, for particularly the patients we were seeing at Roswell at that time.
There seems to be this huge push in immunology across the board at many cancer centers. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what immunology is and what makes it so intriguing when it comes to treating cancer?
Yeah, so immunology, in terms of cancer research, or immuno-oncology as we call it now, has really stepped forward as another platform for therapy. For years, it was chemotherapy and radiation and different offshoots of that, and immunotherapy just kind of sat in the background. And I think some of that was that we didn't know enough about how our immune system really worked in terms of being in a patient with cancer. So immunotherapy is really harnessing the body's own immune system and turning that loose against the tumor or blood cancer or what form of cancer they have, and using your body's antibodies and T cells, white blood cells, things like that to naturally home in and destroy that tumor. And what's changed most in the last, I guess, 5 to 10 years is that we've learned how to modulate some of that, and we've learned how to present different targets to the immune system better. So your body learns how to develop and focus that immune attack. And we've known how to do this for infectious diseases for the longest time. But it's only more recently that we're learning how to turn that loose on a tumor. It involves kind of tweaking things a little differently than we've thought of in the past, but it's been fairly successful in a number of other cancers. Now I think we're seeing that, I think we're starting to punch through that wall in terms of getting some of these therapies into the brain, which is really exciting for us to kind of be on the forefront of this type of research.
And the basics, I mean, if we really stripped it down, immunotherapy is technically taking your immune system's best defenses and using that against whatever cancer you have.
Yeah, so there's different ways of looking at it. In our case, the SurVaxM survivin is a vaccine. So we're giving a vaccine to a patient, and that patient develops T cells and antibodies, much like they would to the flu or COVID vaccine, that kind of thing. And those same antibodies and T cells will home in on the tumor target. There's other ways to do it where you can actually take the antibodies, develop them in the lab, and give those directly to a patient. And that's something we see with checkpoint inhibitors. There's PD-1 inhibitors that we see a lot about, and that's generally what those are. Those are an antibody that binds directly to a receptor on the cell surface that either turns the cell on or turns it off. And that's one of those things we're learning more about, how to control those immune cells. And then there's another step where we can take T cells, white blood cells, right out of the body and genetically engineer them to go after new targets. And you'll see those as referred to as CAR T cells or engineered T cell receptor cells.
Oh, okay.
Adoptive transfer type cells, things like that. And there's several of those therapies that are pretty exciting as well.
I mean, if that's being developed in a lab and then put back into somebody's body to turn on or turn off a receptor or to attack specific cancer cells, is there a reason why it's not more prominent in battling brain cancer as it does in breast cancer and blood cancer?
Yeah, so there's several aspects to that. So, I mean, one and maybe the most obvious is that the brain is often referred to as what they call immunoprivileged. Really, for the longest time, people have thought that you can't get an immune response in the brain, or you don't get immune cells going into the brain. You don't get inflammation. The brain's protected from having an immune response in it. And it's not necessarily the case anymore. We've learned more about the immune system. We've learned how to get those agents into the brain better, be it through altering what's known as the blood-brain barrier or using types of cells and antibodies that can naturally get through those defenses of the brain.
Okay.
So that's one aspect, so it's just kind of a physical barrier. But one of the big ones really is that as prominent as brain cancer seems, and it's kind of a strange thing. There's 14,000 patients a year diagnosed, which puts it in the category of a rare disease, extremely rare disease, actually. But yeah, as time goes on, it seems like everybody knows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brain cancer patients that they've encountered just in their daily life or in their family. So it seems so much more prominent than that. So it comes down to a lot of how many trials are going to be done, how much funding is available for many of these trials, and how many researchers are in that field, really.
Okay.
And that's unfortunately one of those areas where brain cancer lags behind a bit compared to something like breast cancer that is hundreds of thousands of cases, and the field of brain cancer is about a tenth the size of that.
Wow.
So it sometimes lags behind just trying to make these translations. And we're working hard to get there, but it comes down to funding and manpower and things like that, which are kind of an unfortunate reality of it all.
It does seem like there is a bit more of a push in the last few years to really get behind brain cancer treatments and more initiatives in that area. And as you said before, there does seem to be more and more people that know 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I mean, I personally, since my husband passed away a year and a half ago, have probably met over 200 individuals that have been impacted by brain cancer in some way, shape, or form, whether it was them directly or their mom or dad or their spouse or just some random woman in a coffee shop who, wondered what my producer and I were doing on location once and said, "Oh, my best friend has brain cancer." And it surprises me when I hear these numbers of how extremely rare it still is. And then I think about the sheer number of people that I have met, and stories I've heard from across the globe that are just impacted by this. And it just astounds me that it doesn't feel that rare. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly the same feeling. And even looking at it from a research aspect, this is what we do. It's not that different in the lab from working on any other cancer target.
Hmm.
It's just when you get out there for trying to start some of these trials up, it's a little more difficult. And, there's not as much infrastructure set up to get this number of trials going.
Mm.
And the goal is to treat as many patients as we can, across all the trials. And if you think that, say, there's 20 or 30 phase 1 studies open, and many of those studies only take 10 or 20 patients on board, that's not a lot of opportunity for additional treatment of GBM.
Right.
So it's hard to really accept that. That's one of the things that we've always driven at, that, we've got to do better.
Hmm.
I see this as one of those things. There's a set of guidelines that the National Cancer Center puts out for physicians to follow for brain tumor treatment. And, in many other cancers, it comes down to try this chemotherapy, try this form of radiation.
Right.
The first item on glioblastoma is seek clinical trials. We've got to do better. We've got to get more treatments out there. And like you said, it just seems like there's so many more patients out there.
Hmm.
But I think the network is that much smaller too, that, we don't really have, huge national drive for getting some of these projects done. You see some of the big fundraising networks around some of the more common cancers, and there's items in stores branded with pink ribbons and all that, which is great.
Right.
But that's some of those things that help move those along. And we're seeing more and more of that for brain cancer now too. I think the advocacy networks have really started to engage. I think social media has really picked up on some of this and brought more awareness. I think we just got to keep doing more and more and more till I think we get some more federal level support of some of these projects that are going on.
Hmm.
I guess just to clarify some of that too, well, where these clinical trials go, they're often based on academic studies that have been funded by the NIH, National Institute of Health, or the National Cancer Institute at a basic level. And oftentimes when we get out to the point that we want to do clinical trials, there's not much of that federal money available to move those trials along.
I see.
It's really, really a shortcoming. And I think the way the programs are set up is that they expect large pharmas to come in and develop those things further from the lab. And that doesn't always happen to some of these promising agents. And that's one of the things that we're trying to move along ourselves to some degree, kind of a grassroots type initiative.
Right.
Our drug is something that's discovered in Buffalo and developed in Buffalo, and hopefully we can get it approved in Buffalo soon.
So let's dive into this a little bit more. So you're the president of MimiVax, which is a company closely associated or partnered with Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. And it was specifically because of the survivin vaccine technology that you and Dr. Fenstermaker developed. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this goes to our paradigm of getting an agent out to patients that
Hmm.
we saw pretty early on that if we're going to rely strictly on basic research to move this ahead, it could end up as another one of these cures that do great in the lab in the test tubes, but then never sees the light of day clinically.
Mm-hmm.
We jumped on this pretty early because we saw really strong effects of the drug in the lab, and we thought this was really something that could make an impact. So we developed MimiVax around it to develop it through clinical trials, and it's in association with Roswell, so we're
Mm-hmm.
co-founders of the company. But the goal with MimiVax was that we would be able to engage with commercial pharmaceuticals and investors and the business side of things to look for other resources that could move the clinical trials ahead faster. Grants and all that from the NCI are great, but things move incrementally slow on that pathway, and we hope to use this to accelerate the development of the drug. And so far, it's been pretty successful. We've moved the SurVaxM from phase 1 all the way to a phase 2B, which is almost on its next stop before what they call a pivotal study, which would tee the drug up for a registration study. And that's would be the ultimate success of the company. Its goal was to get this drug to patients, and so far I think we're succeeding at that.
So now, what made you guys think that you wanted to look at a vaccine when it came to treating a brain cancer such as glioblastoma? I mean, why a vaccine?
So a vaccine was appealing to us very early on, mainly based on side effect profiles. Standard of care for glioblastoma and many cancers is really based on chemotherapy. And when you look at that, chemo brings a whole host of side effects, and some miserable, some tolerable. But a lot of those drugs are always based on how much of a dose can a patient tolerate. If you think about that, that's kind of a rough place to go. You're
Right.
basically poisoning a patient and trying to see how much you can get in there to kill the tumor. But a vaccine is selective. It shouldn't really have any nasty side effects. It should target the tumor and the tumor only. It was a way to maybe add on to standard of care. It was a way to bring in a type of therapy that would maybe improve a patient's quality of life. If a patient can come in and get an injection in the arm, hang around for a few minutes to an hour and go home,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a tremendous improvement on their quality of life, not having to be hooked up to an IV or any kind of machine or anything, something that could be delivered simply and make their life better, while still having an effect on the tumor.
So explain to our listeners a little bit about how the vaccine works. It's based on survivin vaccine technology. So explain a little bit about how this actually attacks the tumor. Like, what does it do once it's in the body? How does it work?
Yeah. So this gets into the biology behind it a little bit. So the vaccine is targeted to a protein that's part of cancer cells called survivin.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a protein we discovered, but it's one that's been out there for a little bit of time, but hasn't really been focused on all that much. It's survivin as a protein that's normal biology, its normal habitat, interferes with a cell's natural ability to trigger an event they call apoptosis. This is cell death or cell suicide. So when a cell makes a bad transition, it's transitioning to a tumor cell, or its DNA hasn't copied right and there's errors in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a normal program in your cells that will eliminate that cell. It's a self-programmed cell death.
Mm-hmm.
Survivin interferes with that and prevents that program from activating. So that is actually a protein that partially drives the tumor. So the tumor needs this protein to exist.
Huh.
So we thought that would be a good target to go after. It's like, hey, this would be something specific. Now, it turns out survivin has some normal functions as well, but it's in developing fetus. It's actually known as an oncofetal protein. So it's normal in fetal development, possibly early childhood development, but then it's turned off, and then we never see it again as an adult.
Really? So this is something that goes dormant as you grow. So it's something that you have as a child that's activated, but then it kind of just shuts down?
Yeah, exactly. It's responsible for the growth of the body during development. And once
Wow.
you're developed, you don't really have that turned on anymore. But that's
Interesting.
something that the tumor cells have tapped into to give them their longevity. It prevents them from being wiped out. And this is something that ties into immunotherapy in general, too, that we're starting to recognize that many cancers are a result of a faulty immune response. Your body has stopped recognizing these tumor cells that develop. Probably in many normal people, there's tumor cells developing all the time, but your immune system picks up on them quickly, or the apoptotic system picks up on them quickly and wipes them out. If it gets by that point, it's tapping into some of these other proteins that allow those cells to survive when they shouldn't. So that made a nice target for a vaccine. This is something that's specific to the tumors. It's not, hopefully not going to target your liver cells or kidneys or somewhere else it's not supposed to go. So it was kind of a natural opportunity to try a vaccine against it to see if we could turn on that immune system again and train it to go after tumor cells. And that's really what the vaccine does. So the vaccine itself it's a protein target that's derived from the survivin protein. So we take a little piece of that, and we've modified its structure a little bit to make it more immunogenic, produce a stronger immune response than it normally would. And that's put into a cocktail of what they call adjuvants. These are carriers and other proteins that help stimulate an immune response. In some respects, if you think about how people have an allergic response, well, that's an immune response as well. And it's kind of like, say, injecting a piece of shellfish into a patient that has a shellfish allergy. You want to stimulate the body to recognize that and get aggravated about that. But it's in a controlled setting, so it's just a small little response, and we're not triggering like anaphylactic shock or anything, but it gets the body to recognize that this is a danger signal. This is something that's not supposed to be here. It's a foreign protein. I better do something about it. So that triggers an antibody response and a T cell response at the same time. So it's something we refer to as cytotoxic T cells. So these are T cells that will home down, and once they're activated by the vaccine, will hunt down tumor cells and destroy them. And the antibody that's produced at the same time will also go out and coat these tumor cells, which then the rest of your immune system will go and use that antibody to target and clean them up. Macrophages and dendritic cells will pick up on some of those antibodies and destroy the tumor that they're attached to.
So it's kind of like a double whammy to the tumor.
Yeah. So we're coming at it from two different immune mechanisms per se. So it's both a cells and antibody response. And that's something that's made it a little more unique.
How does it know to target the cancer that's in the brain? I mean, if, let's say you've got some other immune deficiencies or an autoimmune disease, how does it know? Is it just because it's a cancer, so it just knows that that's where it needs to go?
Well, so your immune cells are always patrolling the body. So once a T cell is activated, it actually does pass through the blood-brain barrier and will look for cells that have this target on them.
Okay.
Kind of like a red flag. So those tumor cells have that flag on them. They don't necessarily realize they're doing that, but the T cells and the antibodies can recognize that as they pass through the blood, as they pass through the tissue. They will engage with that target, and then the cells will make a kill for whatever that's attached to. Luckily, we haven't seen those flags attached to anything else, so they're doing a pretty good job of just targeting the tumor so far.
That's impressive. And a key note to really zero in on here is that this vaccine is crossing that blood-brain barrier in the clinical trials and the studies and the research and the lab work that you guys have done to date, correct?
Right. And that's something that's unique, and something is one of these things that we've learned about immunology the past 5-10 years or so. Normally, you could throw a bunch of T cells at the blood-brain barrier and they don't go through because they're not activated. They're not trained. The vaccine has the ability to train those cells and turn on different cell surface receptors, kind of like a lock and key mechanism. And now those cells are able to pass through the blood-brain barrier because they're an activated T cell. It's a slightly different presentation of what's on the surface of that cell. So as it approaches the barrier, there's other cells that basically guardian cells of the blood vessels in the brain, and that forms the barrier. But these activated T cells have the key to pass through that, and it allows them to penetrate through the tissue deeper.
So now, what are you seeing in the clinical trials that you've done up to this point before we've gotten into phase 2B? What results have you been seeing in the limited trials that you were doing?
Yeah, so this is really what's really driven us to this point. So we, in our very first clinical trial, was a phase 1 study in recurrent glioblastoma. It was just a small study of 8 patients. And these were patients that were failed by everything. Some of them were twice recurrent glioblastoma. Many of them were expected to really only have about 3 to 6 months left to live.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was just a study to see if there was any toxicity with the vaccine, to see how well patients would tolerate it. And this was the first time it would ever be given to patients before, first time in human. And what we saw in that study is, of those 8 patients who we only expected to live a short time frame, 7 of them survived over a year, and then another 3 or 4 survived over 2 years, all the way out to 7 years.
Wow.
And seeing that in a patient that was basically told they had no more options, there's nothing else we can even give you,
Right.
that was incredible. To see the patients coming back year after year was amazing. You don't see that in.
Not in glioblastoma.
It's an awful disease. But that gave us the reason to move forward and continue its development. So we put it into a phase 2 study, and this time we switched it to newly diagnosed glioblastoma. So we wanted to get a hold of patients a little sooner, maybe not when they had been failed by everything.
Right.
We have a better chance of extending their survival if we can get on there sooner. And that's the same for many cancers now. The sooner you can get into a trial or a study is the better. But in the phase 2A, now we moved up to 60 patients and had now moved out to several different cancer centers. So this
Mhm.
was being done at Roswell Park, Cleveland Clinic, Mass General, and Dana-Farber Cancer Institutes now. So we're building a bigger network, and that helps bring more patients, but it also helps the robustness of the data. So it's not just one center participating and getting great results. Now it's 5 centers participating and getting the same results.
Mhm.
And what we saw now is an overall survival for newly diagnosed patients extended out to about 25 months.
Wow.
Again, we're seeing long-term survivors in this study. So in this case, there's still about 15, 16 patients that are all 5 years out with newly
Wow.
diagnosed glioblastoma. And again, even from the newly diagnosed position, it's kind of unheard of.
Right.
It's unfortunate, but I mean, overall survival is only about 15 months for newly diagnosed glioblastoma.
Right.
And here we've got patients on average getting 25 months, and these long-term survivors at 5 years out. Many who still haven't had any sign of progression. So what we've learned is the vaccine's really good at preventing tumor progression,
Mhm.
which if you think about how a vaccine works, it kind of fits the bill. This has always been kind of a struggle for ourselves. Like, well, why does a vaccine therapeutically reduce a tumor size? We don't really think about a vaccine as attacking a tumor, but it really can. And if you think about the paradigm, we're preventing that tumor from coming back. So it's much like an infectious disease. We're preventing the infectious disease from occurring, but now we're also preventing those tumor cells from coming back. And it seems like the longer we can prevent that recurrence, the
Mhm.
longer chance at a longer life.
And something else gets developed or comes along and
Yeah. So this is one of those things. We hope there's more therapies coming because you really want to put more out there. You can stack these therapies. You can add additional immunotherapies.
it sounds like this vaccine is also it's teaching the body how to attack these very rare glial cancer cells. It seems like the body is learning from the vaccine just like any other vaccine and training its own immune system to shut these down and keep these from growing and progressing.
Right. And that's the goal of immunotherapy, and particularly this type of immunotherapy we're vaccinating, is that your own body picks up and figures out how to do it. So to kind of parallel that, patients on this study are given a vaccine once every 2 weeks over a period of about 2 months. And that's kind of the initial induction phase. But then after that, they come back just for a booster dose every 3 months or so. In this case, some of these patients have just gotten a booster now over that 5-year period. So
Wow.
there's really nothing else they're doing. Many aren't on their chemotherapy or really anything else anymore. They're just coming back for the vaccine, and that's that. So the quality of life comes back into play again. That this is something pretty exciting.
It's definitely a game changer when it comes to finding innovative ways to really tackle and attack glioblastoma, because you really do have to think outside the box. You have to be aggressive in approach because the cancer itself is aggressive. So you guys are now in phase 2B clinical trials, which has opened up to, it means more patients newly diagnosed can look at being recruited based on certain criteria. And you guys have even more centers available for the recruitment phase. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is really the main excitement going on in the company right now. So we've just opened the phase 2B, like you said. It's a recapitulation of the phase 2A, but it's in a larger setting with more centers. And it's what they call a randomized controlled study. So there are patients that would not be receiving the vaccine that this is compared to. And this is the gold standard that's required by the FDA to eventually get approval.
Mm-hmm.
So the study is structured to enroll about 300 patients. It's already open at 12 centers across the country. We hope to get it closer to 15 or 20. There may even be some international centers if we can get that going.
That would be
We're
great.
excited about that.
Yeah.
But this is really the last step towards getting into a pivotal study. So as this begins, the goal is to recruit enough patients to convince the FDA to allow us to convert this from a phase 2B into a phase 3. And then that phase 3 is what's known as the pivotal registration trial, and that's used for approval of the drug.
Okay.
So we're marching our way to that. And some of the reasons why it's a phase 2B is that there's some regulatory aspects that have to be performed along the way.
Of course.
There has to be some randomized data. Unfortunately, I don't really like having to do that, but it's part of the way FDA looks at things. So once we have some of that early data, we should be able to convert this over to that pivotal study, and that'll be really exciting. This is something right now, even just being able to give it to 300 patients is going to be exciting because that greatly improves the reach and more patients that we can see with it. This is really the big step to getting it to approval. So far, we've treated 12 patients in the last couple of months. It's only been open 2-3 months now, and the patients are coming from all over the country. So most of them have been at Roswell, which is a good thing, but I think that's some of the notoriety we have at Roswell for immunotherapy.
Right.
And we've attracted patients, again, from Boston and as far out as Seattle and Texas, where we have other cancer centers open.
Wow.
So it's exciting seeing the spread, being able to treat those patients, but it's also exciting to see the PIs and the other cancer centers coming together on this.
Mm-hmm.
They're interested, and many of these centers have approached us asking to participate. So it's something that's really reassuring to us that other key opinion leaders out there have seen that there's something here. There's something that's gotten their interest, and it's something they want to get to their patients too. So the collaboration around the study has been really incredible, and seeing these different cancer centers coming together and working together to try and make this trial happen has been really exciting for us to be part of.
So now, what is the process to get in to this phase 2B for recruiting purposes? What would a patient need to do? What criteria needs to be met in order for them to be considered a good candidate?
So the pathway into the trial would, in most cases, simply asking their treating physician to see if they can qualify for it, and
Mm-hmm.
the treating physician would then contact one of the centers. They can always reach out directly to Roswell Park as the central site. That kind of makes it as an easy site for them to gain access to it. The trial is also listed on the government page, which is called clinicaltrials.gov. some of the advocacy networks have a listing for it too. So there's ways to find it.
I have it as well on our website. I have a direct link. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, if there's a link there, that's good. But what it's open for is patients who are newly diagnosed who would also be receiving surgery, tumor resection of their tumor, and starting their radiation treatment. So these are patients that receive standard of care, that are planned to receive standard of care, and then the vaccine will be given on top of that. Since it's given up front, we're looking for patients that are recently diagnosed, just beginning their radiation step, which is typically a month after surgery, so that we can prepare and have the vaccine ready to give them right after they get out of radiation. So standard of care for a newly diagnosed patient consists of surgery, the month of radiation, and then there's a few weeks that they have to recover from radiation and surgery before they start their chemotherapy, which is typically temozolomide.
Mm-hmm.
So we're inserting the vaccine into that period where it's the recovery period. There's nothing else really for them at that point besides recovery. And it's just a good time for the vaccine to be inserted in there. The patient's still relatively healthy. They're doing a little better because the tumor has been removed. They haven't really seen much chemotherapy yet, so the immune system hasn't been affected by that. So it seems like a little better opportunity to, as they say, prime an immune response. So those are the patients we're looking for. Besides those criteria, it's really just some more general type clinical trial. The patient has to be healthy enough to receive a vaccine. There's not like an age requirement or anything else. There's some molecular requirements in that we just need to know some characteristics about their tumor, but there's very little to exclude it in that manner.
Which is a big deal because I know for some of the other clinical trials, the molecular makeup of the tumor can really exclude certain patients, which can be really tough
Yeah.
when you're looking at glioblastoma. So that's interesting that this doesn't exclude a whole lot of variations of the tumor. But I'm also curious to know, there are a lot of patients that have jumped on this Avastin kind of. A lot of doctors are pushing their patients into Avastin more so when they're newly diagnosed. And a lot of what happens is during or right after that radiation period, they're getting that dose before starting chemo. Would that preclude somebody from, because I know that the Avastin seems to work, but this seems to be more effective.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we get in these situations where to test a new form of drug or immunotherapy, you can only mix so much into the pot.
Okay.
And that's one of these things that, so if they were taking Avastin, they wouldn't be able to come into the study just yet. So it's exclusive to just standard of care being radiation and temozolomide.
What are your hopes for the vaccine? Where would you like to see this in a few years?
So, I mean, ideally, we simply want approval for newly diagnosed GBM. I think it's something that we've demonstrated quite a bit of safety for, and hopefully we can demonstrate efficacy that's sufficient for FDA to want to approve it, and then we can make it available for brain tumor patients. One of the interesting things about survivin, our target, is that it's actually expressed in 90% of cancer. The reality here is this is not just a brain tumor vaccine, but that target is expressed in many other forms of cancer. It's expressed in multiple myeloma, bone marrow cancer.
Wow.
It's expressed in neuroendocrine tumors. It's expressed in a number of pediatric cancer brain tumors as well. But it's also in things like prostate and breast cancer. So I see a lot of opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, this could be a cancer vaccine. It doesn't have to necessarily be a brain tumor cancer vaccine.
Right.
It's just there's a lot of development along each one of those pathways to try and get it there. And we started some of that. And we have a phase 1 study open right now. It's full and closing up, but we're finally going to get some data from it. But we have a phase 1 study in multiple myeloma. So we hope to have some data for that soon. And we've recently just opened a pediatric study to look at children with medulloblastomas, high-grade gliomas, ependymomas, as well as DIPG. These are the diffuse infiltrate pontine gliomas, which are a really devastating
Right.
diagnosis for children. So we're recruiting on that as well. And that's going to be open in 17 centers across the country.
Wow.
With some help from the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium, who's actually the group sponsoring the trial and running the trial for us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another exciting collaboration to see if we can add more indications and find more applications for patients that could benefit potentially from the drug.
It sounds like there's a lot of hope, a lot of promise surrounding this vaccine. And so the phase 2B clinical trial is still open. Once that finishes, how long does it typically take to be able to move into a phase 3?
So the goal is actually to turn the 2B into a phase 3. So what we're structured right now is that we hope to get data from our first 75 to 100 patients on the study
Mm-hmm.
at what they call a surrogate endpoint. So we'll be able to look at these patients at 12 months, see how they're doing, and if that data is good, which we expect it to be, we can present that to the FDA to request a conversion to a phase 3 trial. And that's the goal right now. So if that happens, we could convert to a phase 3, and say realistically closer, 18 to 24 months from now.
Wow.
And then continue it on for a phase 3, which again will take another 1 to 2 years to finish up the trial. But
Mm-hmm.
the goal is to have this in for an FDA approval in the next 5 years.
That's extremely exciting. It really lifts my heart to hear the progress that's being made with this, because there is so few options out there that are really potent when it comes to kicking glioblastoma to the curb, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And for patients that are out there who are listening, understand and know that this particular trial is currently recruiting and really does need patients newly diagnosed with glioblastoma. So, do not hesitate to take a look, to get online, go to our resources. I'm excited to see this in the hands of more patients, to have patients out there have this as a viable option just on a regular basis. To have this become part of the standard of care is really exciting to hear. And at MimiVax, is this the only clinical trial that you guys are currently working on as far as the vaccine? I know you said you've opened it up to pediatrics, where you guys are currently recruiting for that. Are there other clinical trials that MimiVax is working on, or is this is what you guys are focused on right now?
So it's the primary focus, but there are other things going on. So like I mentioned, there's a multiple myeloma trial, there's a
Mm-hmm.
neuroendocrine tumor trial, and the pediatric trial. But as we've learned more and more about the vaccine and learned more about survivin biology, there's always strange things that happen. And we've always been thinking that we follow the data. Whatever the biology tells us, we follow that data and see where it goes. And that's led us to an interesting spot that we've discovered that survivin is again expressed in particular autoimmune cells. So we're exploring the area of autoimmunity now with an antibody that is developed in part from the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
But we're able to use this antibody in a disease called myasthenia gravis. This is an autoimmune condition where patients have an autoimmune response to their motor neuron end plates. It leads to paralysis in patients of
Okay.
their diaphragm and things that you obviously don't want to be messing with. But it turns out that we can, at least preclinically in models, reverse the autoimmune response of some of these effects and potentially have a treatment for autoimmune disease. And we've seen survivin expressed in these B cells of myasthenia gravis, but we also see that it's expressed in cells associated with multiple sclerosis, and of all things, rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
We're just kind of like, wait a minute, this shouldn't even be possible, but it looks like there's other ways the body is tapped into that target. And one of the things we found out is if you think about autoimmune response and autoimmune disease, it's usually caused by your immune system going a little haywire, going a little too aggressive or too long lived. And it's the same mechanism of longevity that these cells have picked up. An autoimmune cell that's producing antibodies to your own tissues should have turned itself off and gone away a long time ago if it started to do that. Your body has
Right.
safeguards against it, but it didn't. And here they are tapping into survivin as their way to circumvent the body's safeguards, just like a cancer cell would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out the same therapy is able to reverse that process as well. So there's all sorts of different offshoots of this that we're exploring. And the autoimmune is all preclinical academic stuff at this
Right.
point, but we're hopeful to get that into a clinical trial soon with some collaborators that we have at George Washington University in DC. So it's an exciting time for us. There's all sorts of other aspects going on in the company, trying to find more ways to use the vaccine and more ways to use the data that we get from the vaccine. This is
Mm-hmm.
something we see with clinical trials, is that the first step is just giving the drug to the patient, but we learn so much about the drug and ultimately about the disease through the clinical trials, and much of it's not anticipated. You just kind of are the recipient of this data and want to find some benefit from it. And there's just all sorts of new, interesting aspects that you gain from that. And we're really thankful for the patients who come into these trials, because we would never learn about the biology of where this goes. Hopefully we're able to treat that patient on trial so they have benefit, but it's also about the patients that'll come after them, and we learn so much that can be applied towards future trials and future applications.
Right.
It's really kind of mind-boggling after a while when you look at the amount of data that comes out of these trials, and what it can do and where we can go with it.
Well, I have to say, I'm very excited to see where MimiVax as a whole is headed. It sounds like there's some really exciting opportunities on the horizon, and the SurVaxM vaccine continues recruiting. I'm definitely very excited, and I know our listeners will be too, to hear about the progress and the current results and where the hope is for this going. So having you on today has just been an enormous privilege, and hearing some of this information and having it broken down for our listeners just to see how valuable and important this vaccine has the potential to be, and where it's going. For our listeners, before we conclude our show here, let our listeners know where they can look you up, where they can find more information about the company. I know we've mentioned where they can find information about the clinical trial. And again, they can go to Roswell Park's website. They can go to my website at the Game on Glio podcast. I do have a direct link that'll take people to the recruiting page, but let them know where they can find more information about MimiVax. And then through that, because you guys have a lot of information, press releases, news, and stuff like that, that you put up on the site.
Yeah, so we do have our webpage. It's mimivax.com, and that kind of curates everything that we're doing, has links to the trials, press releases. It also has links to the centers that are offering the trial, the phase 2B particularly. We've tried to strategically move those around the country. So there are centers on the West Coast, there's centers in the South, and as well as the Northeast. So hopefully there's a center that is nearby for patients to get seen at. But there's a lot of just background information with the vaccine and all that there, as well as Roswell Park. I mean, that's obviously comprehensive cancer center and plethora of information for glioblastoma, but as well as the other cancers and other forms of immunotherapy. It's definitely a point that I think all patients really should be looking into, going to a cancer center. Roswell Park's right here in our backyard is just something that they should really take advantage of and take advantage of early. This is not something you want to wait around with and try and figure out what options are there.
Right.
And you want to get a hold of those as soon as you can. The other ways that patients and caretakers and all that have been involved with this too. Sometimes it feels funny asking about it, but it comes out is where the support for some of these things come from. And for us, that's really been a phenomenal level of support from the Roswell Park Alliance, as well as a number of rides that have gone on through the Western New York area, particularly the Ride for Roswell and your own trail ride as well, which is, been able to really help patients get into these studies. And that's the point I want to make, is that there's always ways to donate to these studies and to donate to the Alliance, but the funds that come in for those things go 100% into these trials to help pay for patient costs. And a clinical trial, especially at the level that it's at for what they call a late stage trial, they're not inexpensive. And most of that is really for patient care. Just to share, for an example, it costs about $50,000 per patient to have them on trial. And that's just the patient cost. That's got nothing to do with the company or anything like that. That's just the patient care. And all those donations that come in offset that and really make room for another patient on the study. And that's something that MimiVax has had support all along. And we're incredibly thankful for that, because none of this would even exist without that kind of support.
Well, and on that note, I want to make sure that people know, that our listeners know, that Traphagen's Trail Ride for Brain Cancer is currently running right now. We will be fundraising for the next month and a half through October 15th, when we hold our cycling event. All of these funds do go into Roswell Park brain cancer initiatives, and the SurVaxM vaccine is at the top of that list. So all of the money that we are pushing to raise through the fundraiser, all of your donations that come in, will go to support this initiative. So it is vital that I stress that, because our fundraiser is open right now. So for everybody listening, you can go to give.roswellpark.org/go/Traphagen's Trail Ride for brain cancer. And the 4 is number 4, brain cancer. So please go take a look. We have a ton of information on that page. Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great interview. I have thoroughly enjoyed having you on. I'm very excited about all of the information that is coming out of this clinical trial, and I appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. It's we're eternally grateful for these kind of opportunities to even just talk about what we do and shed some light on what the clinical trial process is and some of the exciting research that's going on right in our own backyard here in Buffalo. So it's a cool thing to be part of, and it's a great thing to share.
It's a proud moment.
Thank you.
Yes. And with that, we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by MimiVax LLC, developing immunotherapeutic vaccines and therapies for treatment of cancers such as glioblastoma. Learn more at mimivax.com. OncoSynergy is a biotechnology company that develops therapeutics to dramatically improve the standard of care for patients suffering from the worst cancers. Founded by physicians frustrated with the limited treatment options available to brain cancer patients, OncoSynergy is now on a mission to develop better treatments for those battling brain cancer. OncoSynergy's passion and drive have led to the prioritized development of their leading therapeutic, OS-2966, for treatment of glioblastoma. OS-2966 works by blocking a key receptor that manages cancer-promoting communications between tumor cells and their surroundings. Based on encouraging preclinical data, OncoSynergy has now launched a phase 1 clinical trial for treatment of recurrent glioblastoma. The trial is currently enrolling patients at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida. Learn more about OncoSynergy and their phase 1 clinical trial at oncosynergy.com. It's amazing as we learn more and more about brain cancer and what that actually means. To look at an inhibitor, a protein so small that it's one of the smallest members of the protein family, yet it is so potent, it can actually promote cancer to grow. A small protein like survivin. And yet doctors and scientists are constantly looking for new ways to combat brain cancer, glioblastoma, and many other forms of cancers. And this little protein could be the trick that actually breaks through the barriers where others have failed. And that's the hope, to progress in brain cancer treatment. I'm so thankful to have had Dr. Ciesielski on today. He has taught us so much about the work that they are doing over at MimiVax and at Roswell Cancer Center. And as they continue to explore and manipulate and research the survivin protein and find new ways to expand the SurVaxM vaccine, my hope is that they will find new ways to not only treat brain cancer, but to give brain cancer patients and other cancer patients longevity, years, time. We learn so much by doing this podcast. We learn so much by being in the field, by being advocates, by being fighters. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. And if you want to learn more, you can visit MimiVax.com. They are also currently recruiting for their SurVaxM vaccine. It's a phase 2B clinical trial, so it's very important because they are very far along in the process with this clinical trial, and that is such terrific news and such happy news. So please feel free to look at our website for recruitment information. You can also visit their website, or you can call Roswell Park Cancer Center to learn more. But don't ever lose hope in what clinical trials can offer. I know sometimes for some people it seems like a long shot or a last-ditch effort, but they really shouldn't be looked at as last attempts. They should be looked at as the first line of defense, especially when it comes to beating very rare and very hard to treat cancers. And we have to be able to do all that we can. Because the minute we start to lose hope, we start to lose progress. And that is something that we should never do. We not only have to believe in ourselves, but we have to believe in those who are working alongside of us, fighting alongside of us to find ways to end some of these horrible cancers. So for all of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Please feel free to share our podcast with others. We are always looking for reviews, for new ways to grow, for new listenership. I hope you enjoyed the 2 episodes for August. We will be doing this again in October with 2 amazing episodes. But until then, please feel free to follow us on Facebook and on Instagram, and we will be back in September with another amazing episode. Thank you so much. Until next month. You've been listening to the Game on Glio podcast, the podcast that is designed to educate, advocate, and tell the real stories of those walking the journey of brain cancers such as glioblastoma and grief and loss. If you like our show, please share us with others. Follow us on Instagram at Game on Glio Podcast or on Facebook at Game on Glio. You can visit our website and our YouTube channel. You can find us anywhere podcasts are played.